Mercedes may have found a way to gain up to 15 extra horsepower, without technically breaking the rules. And the FIA just stepped in. Days after pre-season testing ended, new technical evidence triggered an imminent vote that could force a mid-season engine redesign. We are talking about a potential 3 to 4 tenths per lap advantage, hidden inside something most fans never even hear about. Compression ratio. Cold, the engine looks legal. 16 to 1. Exactly within the regulation. But when it reaches race temperature, rivals believe that number could climb. 17. Maybe even 18 to 1. More power. More efficiency. More straight-line speed. And here is why this is explosive. If the FIA approves a new hot temperature test, Mercedes could be forced to reduce compression mid-season, lose power, recalibrate maps, and possibly surrender a performance edge that could define the championship. For Verstappen and Red Bull, this is not just news. It is opportunity. Because if Mercedes loses that advantage, the entire competitive balance shifts overnight. But the vote has not happened yet. The meeting is imminent. And what is decided behind those closed doors could change the direction of the 2026 era before it even truly begins. So let's slow this down. Because the real story did not start with a rumor. It started in Bahrain. Pre-season testing is over. Engines ran at full load. Teams collected data. And then something unusual happened. A serious power unit failure struck a Mercedes customer car. That alone would not raise alarms. Engines fail in testing. But what followed is what matters. The FIA inspected the unit. At the same time, rival manufacturers submitted a formal technical dossier questioning Mercedes' combustion design. This was not social media noise. This was official, structured, detailed, and focused on one specific area: compression ratio behavior under temperature. Right now, the 2026 regulation caps compression at 16 to 1. But here is the critical loophole. The measurement is conducted cold, ambient temperature, static inspection. No combustion pressure, no race heat, which opens a fascinating engineering possibility. What if an engine is geometrically compliant at room temperature, but changes behavior when components expand under extreme heat? That is the theory circulating inside the paddock. According to technical analysis, the suspicion is that Mercedes may have engineered piston crowns and combustion chamber volumes in a way that includes a micro-cavity. At cold temperature, that cavity counts toward total chamber volume, which keeps the measured compression ratio legal, 16 to 1. But at race temperature and high pressure, that cavity may effectively seal off, reducing volume, increasing effective compression, 17 to 1, possibly higher. If that is true, the gain is not small. Higher compression improves thermal efficiency. Better combustion efficiency means more power from the same fuel flow. Estimates suggest 10 to 15 additional horsepower. And that matters. Because in modern Formula 1, even 5 horsepower is significant. Now imagine 15. On long straights. On circuits like Monza. On circuits like Jeddah. That becomes measurable lap time. 3 to 4 tenths in certain configurations. And here is the political tension. Under the current rules, Mercedes is technically legal. They passed the cold test. The FIA has confirmed that as of today, there is no breach. But rivals argue that the spirit of the regulation was never meant to allow temperature-dependent compression spikes. Which is why the FIA is now pushing for a second measurement protocol. A mandatory hot test at approximately 130 degrees Celsius. Real operating temperature. If approved, this would immediately reveal whether the compression ratio rises during actual race conditions. And that is why the upcoming vote is critical. Because to pass this change, it requires a supermajority among engine manufacturers, plus approval from the FIA and Formula 1 management. Not unanimous, but politically delicate. If 4 manufacturers support it, and 1 opposes, tension escalates. Now think about the timing. If the vote succeeds and the hot test is introduced mid-season, Mercedes may be forced to adapt quickly. Redesign pistons. Rework combustion chamber geometry. Potentially lose the very advantage that made their engine so competitive. And development windows under the new engine freeze are extremely limited. There are only narrow upgrade opportunities. No unlimited redesign freedom. Which means any forced change costs time, performance, momentum. But if the vote fails, Mercedes continues with the current architecture for the entire season. And any advantage remains intact. That is why this is not just technical. It is strategic. For Red Bull, this is huge. Because they are building long-term around regulatory stability. If Mercedes is forced to recalibrate mid-year, it disrupts competitive balance. It reduces pressure on Red Bull's own engine roadmap. And for Verstappen, it potentially removes a rival advantage before title fights intensify. But there is one more layer. If the FIA eventually clarifies that 16-1 must apply at all times on track, not just during cold measurement, and evidence proves otherwise during competition, that crosses into technical infringement territory. And in Formula One, technical infringements are not symbolic. They lead to disqualifications from events where non-compliance is detected. Points lost. Results erased. That is the extreme scenario. No one is there yet. But the fact that the FIA has escalated this to committee level tells you something important. They see enough evidence to act. And once the governing body begins investigating engine architecture at this depth, it rarely ends quietly. So the next block of this story is not about rumor. It is about outcome. What happens inside that meeting room? Who votes yes? Who votes no? And whether Mercedes' potential advantage becomes history, or becomes the defining controversy of the 2026 era. Now we move into the part nobody can see. The closed-door phase. Because once the FIA calls an imminent power unit advisory committee vote, the conversation shifts from theory to power. And this is where alliances matter. There are 5 engine manufacturers involved in the 2026 era. For the hot test proposal to pass, at least 4 of them must agree, alongside the FIA and Formula One management. That means this is not just about Mercedes. It is about Ferrari, Honda, Audi, Red Bull powertrains. Each of them has something to gain, or something to protect. If Ferrari believes Mercedes has found a structural advantage worth 3 or 4 tenths per lap, they vote yes. If Honda sees long-term regulatory integrity at risk, they vote yes. If Audi wants a clean entry into a fair engine formula, they likely vote yes. But if there is even a hint that others might be using similar temperature-dependent geometry tricks, hesitation appears. And that is the part few are discussing openly. Because while Mercedes is the focus, there are whispers that other power units may also operate close to the boundary, which makes the vote more delicate. Now let's explore the 3 realistic outcomes. First scenario. The hot test is approved for mid-season implementation, around the summer break. In that case, Mercedes has a limited window to prepare a compliant specification. They would need to submit revised combustion chamber designs, possibly re-engineered pistons, recalibrated ignition maps. And that process is not simple. Compression ratio is not a software tweak. It is mechanical architecture. If the effective ratio drops from near 17 back to 16 under race conditions, power output falls. Even a 10 horsepower reduction can shift qualifying battles. And over a championship, momentum changes everything. Second scenario. The vote passes, but with a transitional grace period extending to the following season. Meaning Mercedes can complete the current campaign under the existing cold measurement protocol, but must comply fully with hot testing by the next regulatory cycle. This would avoid political explosion. Avoid mid-season disruption. But it would also allow Mercedes to maintain any current advantage for the year. And that would frustrate rivals deeply. Third scenario. The vote fails. No hot test introduced. Cold measurement remains the only official method. In that case, Mercedes' architecture stands unchallenged for the foreseeable future. And rivals are forced to respond not politically, but technically. Which means redesigning their own combustion strategies. Chasing efficiency through alternative methods. And that escalates an engine war immediately. Now here is where this becomes personal for Red Bull and Verstappen. Because championships are not won only on track. They are influenced by regulation stability. If Mercedes is forced into mid-season redesign, they lose development focus. Engineering resources shift from performance upgrades to compliance fixes. Energy that would have gone into optimization now goes into survival. And that creates opportunity. But if nothing changes, Red Bull must assume Mercedes retains its potential compression edge. Which means every tenth matters. Every aerodynamic gain becomes critical. And every reliability issue becomes costly. Now consider something even more serious. If the FIA clarifies, in writing, that the 16-1 limit must apply at all times during operation, and later evidence proves that a race engine exceeded that threshold while competing, the situation escalates dramatically. That becomes a technical infringement during competition, not a measurement protocol dispute. And in Formula One, technical infringements during events lead to disqualification from that event. Points removed. Results erased. This is not theoretical. This is procedural. And while nobody expects immediate retroactive punishment, the existence of that possibility increases tension. Because now every race weekend becomes a potential protest zone. Every engine teardown becomes sensitive. Every data trace becomes political ammunition. And here is the key detail. The FIA has already requested extensive documentation from Mercedes regarding combustion chamber design and volume calculations. That alone signals scrutiny at the highest level. So what happens next? Behind closed doors, engineers will present simulations. Lawyers will interpret regulatory language. Manufacturers will defend philosophies. And political leverage will be exercised carefully. But once the vote happens, clarity arrives. Either the loophole closes, or it remains open. And whichever direction the decision goes, it reshapes the competitive landscape before the 2026 era truly stabilizes. For Verstappen and Red Bull, this is not about headlines. It is about trajectory. Because if Mercedes' suspected advantage is neutralized, the power balance tilts. If it survives, the fight intensifies. And when engine architecture becomes the center of controversy this early, it rarely ends quietly. The next announcement from the FIA will not just clarify compression ratios. It will reveal which vision of the future Formula One chooses to protect. And this is where the entire situation turns from technical to psychological. Because even before the FIA announces the final decision, something has already changed. Trust. When rival teams formally question the legality of your engine concept, the relationship inside the paddock shifts. Engineers stop sharing informal insights. Political conversations become colder. Every detail is guarded. And that atmosphere alone can influence a season. Now think about Mercedes internally. If there is even a small chance that the hot test passes mid-season, they cannot sit still. They must prepare two parallel paths. One compliant under the current cold test. Another guaranteed safe under a potential hot test. That means double simulation work, double validation cycles, double risk. And in an era where engine architecture is heavily restricted, every development window is precious. So even the threat of regulatory change forces Mercedes to divert resources. That is the hidden cost. Not a penalty, not a disqualification, but distraction. Meanwhile, Red Bull watches. Quietly. Because if Mercedes is forced to lower real compression from a potential 17 range back to 16 under operating temperature, that is not just a small trim adjustment. Lower compression reduces peak cylinder pressure. Lower peak pressure reduces thermal efficiency. Lower efficiency reduces power output. To recover that loss, you must compensate elsewhere. More aggressive ignition timing. Higher turbo stress. Different fuel mapping. Each of those carries reliability risk. And reliability wins championships. Now imagine this unfolding mid-season. One race weekend, Mercedes looks dominant. The next, slightly less explosive on the straights. Questions begin. Commentary intensifies. Confidence shifts. Momentum changes. And Formula One is a sport of momentum as much as mechanics. But there is another layer. If the FIA ultimately decides to introduce the hot test only from the following year, that sends a different message. It signals political compromise. Stability over confrontation. And in that case, Mercedes retains any current structural advantage for the full campaign. Which forces Red Bull to respond on track, not in the boardroom. That means aerodynamic aggression. Weight distribution optimization. Energy deployment refinement. Every marginal gain becomes critical. Now here is the deeper strategic consequence. If compression-based innovation becomes a gray zone battlefield, manufacturers will invest more heavily in thermal behavior research. Material science.